Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Before we get started, let me thank you for being here. The stories on this podcast are meant to let you know that you're not alone in what you're going through and that we can all find strength in struggle with the right perspective. If you've been enjoying the podcast, let me ask that you leave a review on your platform of choice to help us grow so that we can continue to make the world a better place, one conversation at a time. Now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Project Endure podcast, episode 118. We have myself, Joe Rinaldi, and we have a very, very special guest in the great state of New Jersey, Sara Carlesimo. Sara, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. And we were talking before we hit record. You are currently living in Fanwood, New Jersey, which is very close to Westfield, New Jersey, where I grew up. And we were talking about mutual connections and maybe how we cross paths. And I believe it must have to be through Sam Tooley, who I grew up with. He's a good friend of mine. How do you know Sam?
So my relationship with Sam has evolved over time, all for the better. But I originally met Sam through Alpha Fit Club Westfield, which is Alpha's original location. Sam, being the face and one of the founders. I started attending those classes in the middle of COVID. I had returned from Florida for an extended period of time. I was there with my children, with my mom, right? We were still, I think everyone was in a state of unknown. And I came back and I had a friend of mine who had just started attending and said, you know what, I actually think you would really love this programming. It seems incredibly up your alley. And so I attended a couple of the blacktop classes and I just became immediately hooked, became a member, and really started using Alpha Fit Club as my main source of fitness, mental outlet, and training, really. I'd actually contacted Sam seeing that he was competing in High Rocks Austin. And I said to him, hey, if I'm going to Alpha 3 to 4 days a week, do you think I could roll up to this competition and compete? And he said, with confidence, which I appreciate to this day, absolutely, maybe get in 1 or 2 more runs. And so I went to Austin with my now business partner, Elizabeth Roseman. We went and we each competed in the individual. We saw Sam compete. And then I started training with him after that a little more kind of personally, both at Alpha and at the garage, with a focus on these hybrid endurance races. Our relationship then developed further when Alpha Fit Club, Sam, along with Rob and Jerry and the corporate group, decided to launch their franchising campaign. Sam and I were in discussions about, would this be something that I would be interested in? I did not hesitate, immediately said yes. I brought in Elizabeth. We had a couple kickoff conversations with Sam, and then the ball started rolling. And so I think we went from general kind of acquaintances to friends to training partners to now business partners. So it's been a road of development, but in a very positive direction.
I appreciate that context. And just to go back to Sam saying with confidence that you could compete in High Rocks, that confidence is so Sam Tooley. One of my favorite things about Sam is just how convicted he is in the things that he believes in and cares about. And episode 2 of this podcast with Sam is one of my all-time favorite conversations always, because I'm sure, as you know, he's just been through so much and come out the other side very strong. So with that being said, Sara, before all of that and outside of fitness, who are you, to give the audience an idea of who is Sara?
Oh, so if you ask anyone, my friends from home and family, they tend to say like, Sara's superwoman, she's super mom. And I don't really think of myself like that, but I do wear many hats. So outside of fitness, I'm a mother. I have 2 children, ages 8 and 6. I have a daughter and a son. I am a corporate executive. I work in New York City. I run a department. I am also a lawyer, although I'm currently not practicing. But I have a big corporate day job that takes up many hours of my time. It's very fulfilling, very rewarding. But I do that by day. I'm a mother by day and at night, and I use fitness as kind of partly my outlet, but also as a way to retain kind of part of my identity, which I feel sometimes, especially with working mothers, single parents, right? Sometimes your personal identity tends to get lost in the shuffle of the very long hours and all of the demands that we're constantly trying to meet. And so somewhere like alpha and just fitness in general, and training, having my personal goals. And I'm sure we will get into this, right? But I'm focused very heavily on endurance racing right now, Ironman and ultra running, as a way to kind of retain some level of kind of personal control over the daily demands that I have elsewhere.
Yeah, you referenced that personal control and retaining part of your identity. What is it about fitness that gives you that sense of control or gives you that piece of identity that maybe can get lost in all the other chaotic aspects of life?
Of course. So fitness has always been part of my life. I grew up playing multiple sports. I played two sports in college. And I think, post college years, I went to law school. I started working in the city, very long hours, had my children, moved to the suburbs. I think for me, kind of the fitness and the races that I do and the things that I train for, not that you lose yourself by becoming a parent, right? Or taking on these new roles and promotions at work. But I do think it falls so much outside of yourself, and everyone else's needs and demands are constantly being put first, which is not a bad thing. But I do think when it comes to fitness, and especially these endurance races where you're really just with yourself and in your head for an incredibly long period of time, I think you're actually forced to look inward and really find yourself again and connect with your inner self from a conceptual standpoint, but also in your mind. And having that inner connection is what gets you through things like a 6 hour race or a 12-hour race. And I really have found that, especially over the last couple of years, in focusing on this in my fitness journey, kind of nearing 40. I think it's been really important, and it really has become kind of who I am as a person, and something that I'm really proud of.
Mm. I love quotes. And one thing you just said sparked a quote in my mind from Carl Jung, who said, "One who looks outside dreams, one who looks inside awakens." And I think in the world we live in, it's really easy to look at these things and say, I want to achieve this or accomplish that or get there, rather than who am I deep down inside and what can I learn about myself through doing hard things. And I'm curious what you've learned about yourself through the world of endurance sport.
I have so much to say on this topic. I'm so happy you actually brought this up. So I think so. What I've learned in kind of this endurance training, I've done high rocks, I've done DECA, I've done Ironmans, I've done a marathon, right? Half marathons. I think, and not all of them have gone to plan, right? There's been many setbacks and disappointments, right? And I want to bring this up before I forget, but so my business partner, a very intelligent woman, Elizabeth Roseman, always says, disappointment is the gap between your expectation and your reality. And I think so there is this tendency to look outside of ourselves, right? For to meet our expectations or whatever we have expected of ourselves kind of internally. And I think that's where disappointment lies. And I personally have had to do so much work in terms of, okay, I may have these certain expectations now and I am disappointed, but how do I bring this back to myself internally? Because my constant self and your reality is changing every second. So it's, what is the version of me that was in the past that may have, right, like set me back, and where my kind of hopes and dreams are of wanting myself to be a different version, right? So what was the past version of me? What is the current version of me that is standing in this like middle ground that is not yet achieved my dreams? And then what is that final version of me that I want to get to at the finish line, whether it be finishing a race, getting a promotion, right? Reaching a numerical revenue target in my business. So much of society sits in this middle space of you're letting the past kind of define your expectations and your reality, which I think a lot of that is rooted in fear, and I can get a lot more into that. Then you're sitting in your current now, and then not acting on the hopes and dreams, either for fear or for fear of, disappointment and failure. And I think the difference between those who look inward to embody who they want to be and become to get to that final destination, that separates people who succeed and that those who don't get there.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a lot of times we look outward for who we want to become or try to quote unquote find ourselves out there in the world. And I think maybe a better way to look at it for most of us is how do we peel back layers and get closer to the core of who we've always been made to be? And I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that. And I think the topic of disappointment is a very relevant one for a lot of people listening.
100%. I think so. So kind of that hardship and disappointment that we experience, it's actually yourself tagging an emotion to an external experience, and it doesn't actually have to be that way, right? So when we feel disappointment based on factors that are outside of ourselves, when we feel that failure, we feel that either embarrassment that leads to either lack of worthiness, right? Your self-worth isn't where it wants to be. That's because you are creating that emotion and attaching it to that circumstance. And I think that a very difficult thing that most people never succeed at, and I'm constantly working on this, is okay, I'm observing this circumstance, whether we want to tag it as a setback or a failure. And again, it doesn't need to be that way. It's all about reframing in your mind. But I'm observing this, and it's all internally created. And I need to take the time to now acknowledge that the perception of what I'm seeing is actually just a creation. And how do I flip the script essentially on those circumstances so that I no longer look at it as a disappointment? I no longer look at it as a failure. It's either a path that a different road that's going to lead me to actually where I want to be and lead me to the version of myself that I want to become. And maybe what I thought was the success is actually not, right? And I think it's all about categorization of our emotions and our perceptions. And I can give an example that actually has nothing to do with fitness. So after law school, I was working in the city, and I came across the opportunity to clerk for a federal judge. Now, for any lawyer listening, federal clerkships, I think about 3% of applicants actually get accepted, right? So it isn't a big deal, and tagged as kind of one of the most prestigious things that you could do. So I left my job and I took the clerkship. And about a month in, it was immediately clear to me, again, this is not a projection or not taking accountability, but it was not a good fit for a variety of reasons. That to this day still is something that I'm working on, of letting go of that disappointment that it did not work out the way I had expected it to. It took me a very long time to increase my self-worth, and that, oh my God, I wasn't able to do this in the way that it was expected. But now, thinking back on it, right, had I not then left the clerkship at the time that I did, I wouldn't have gone to, at the time, Miami. I wouldn't have, for a wedding, I wouldn't have sat next to an individual who at the time was head of a department at an old financial firm that I ended up taking a position at. And I wouldn't be here really where I'm today, in a career that I love, in a great position that is incredibly senior. And I don't think that I would have gone that path. Actually, I'm almost positive, right? I would have gone probably to a law firm in a litigation department, and it would have sent me on an entire path, which may have been successful, but it definitely would not have placed me where I am today. And so I think there's always that constant work. And again, this is where you take your past circumstances in the story And what are you going to hold on to those stories, and what are you going to take with you and reframe it in a way that is going to allow you to move forward? Because if you're constantly taking your fears of what's happened in the past with you in the future, you're never going to then get to that next version of yourself or your next dream or your next goal, because those old stories of what you tell yourself is going to put up a block.
Mm. Yeah. There's so much there, so much good stuff. I think in order to step into a new way of thinking, a new way of living, part of us has to die. We have to leave an old part of us behind. And even if leaving something behind in a logical manner makes sense, right? Maybe we're leaving something behind that no longer serves us. We're still losing a piece of who we once were. And that is hard. Change is hard for that reason. So I think acknowledging that's important. The other thing is, I'd like to bring up a quote from Tamara Kulish, who said, "Patience is the calm acceptance that things can happen in a different order than the one you have in mind." And I think a lot of times life doesn't just happen in a different order than the one we have in mind. It happens in a completely different way than we ever thought it would. And we can't connect the dots going forward. And that's really hard.
It's incredibly difficult. And I think a lot of people experience this in so many facets of their life, right? Relationships, careers, even races, right? You have a setback, you come back from injury, and then you constantly have that fear of what if it happens again? Or you had the expectation that you wanted to do a certain thing. You either wanted to break a certain, time, you wanted to finish a race, and sometimes it doesn't happen. But again, holding on to that then perpetuates that version of yourself. So I brought this up in another interview I gave a number of years ago. I had raced in the New York City triathlon, and I did not finish the race, about 200 yards short of finishing the race. And I could hold on to that version of myself, and I still, it still bothers me that I didn't finish. But if you look at my reality now, well, I finished countless triathlons, I finished countless half Ironmans, and so that version of me is done. It's done. It was a moment in time, and it doesn't define kind of who you are and what your reality is now and what your future will be. And then I always try and take from those experiences is, okay, I probably, let's say I would have finished that triathlon, I probably actually didn't train, and I really didn't get to a spot until much later, I guess, in life, where prioritizing your training, your nutrition, your rest. At a younger age, I don't think really I appreciated any of those things, hence why I did not finish the race. Taking those and kind of redefining yourself and then what's important to you, and setting new expectations, I think is really what is going to get you to that next stage, and being able to reface those challenges and demons in a different way to get a different outcome.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of patience and time, right? When everyone looks at time as linear, that's when it breaks down, right? Because I think we live in a society of instant gratification. And especially when it comes to longer term and bigger goals and reinventing yourself, you know, you can be in the now, and it also just requires so much patience and trust that your process will work out the way that it's supposed to.
Mm. Yeah, that's very well said. And you touched on the idea of hardships and struggles and all of those sorts of things. And we can use those things to shape us into the person that we would like to become, or we can let them define us if we're not intentional, if we're not purposeful. When you look at your life so far, Sarah, is there a hardest thing that has happened to you that you didn't choose? A circumstance, a situation, an event, something that you didn't choose, but that you dealt with that was the hardest in your life?
Yes. So the absolute hardest thing, without question, was losing my father. So my father passed away in 2015 from cancer. I was pregnant with my first child, with my daughter, and it's so interesting when I talk about it. So it was both a very long process and yet very short and shocking at the same time in the way that it unfolded. And of course, at the time, right, I'm pregnant, I'm nervous. My doctor is telling me I have to relax. And it's like, how do you do those things? And I was in between Florida and New York. That's where my parents lived. at the time to help my mother, go through documents and call agencies and deal with bank accounts. And so it was such a weird thing to have to kind of step outside of the emotion of losing a parent and losing a parent, but also just as an individual, someone who was so influential in my life and just proud of me and of everything I did. He was proud. And then at the same time having to, support my mom as well as my siblings, and then also kind of take this very kind of view of like, all right, now I need to administratively deal with X, Y, and Z because the world turns on, right? And reality sets in, and you have to still continue on a path. But I'm going to say this, and I know this is probably going to come off cold because of course, if I could change the past, I would. But when I try and think about like what path did that put me on and my family, of course, I didn't want my father suffering anymore, and I would give anything to have him back. But if he was still on this earth in the state that he was in, absent a medical miracle, my mother wouldn't have been able to travel to be with me. When I had my daughter, she wouldn't be able to be here to be a grandparent to my now two children. And so I have to look at that. And I think that's very, again, difficult for people, is that they like sit in the circumstance and kind of the reflection of, okay, it's not really a lesson. This was a circumstance that no one should have to feel. But what can we take from it in a way to move forward is that probably the circumstances for my mom would have been very different for her as a caretaker for the long haul, and not being able to experience things that ended up being really positive and great memories for myself, for my kids. She's here right now visiting, right? So it's things like that you constantly have to kind of remember and think of. It's obviously not the ideal path, but it is a path, and it's better than what could have been.
Hmm. When you were going through that loss and you were pregnant, you were dealing with loss of life and at the same time anticipating bringing new life into this world. I'd imagine you were balancing those really, really hard emotions with also just very, very amazing emotions. What was that like, that contrast?
Yes, and the timing of it all, right, is just so it's like ironic, right? Is that it was the full circle of life coming together, quite literally, in a full circle, and it was really, really hard. I think I was initially in shock. Then I went into kind of protection mode, maybe my body and mind preparing myself to be a mother. Went into protection mode for my mom and trying to kind of handle things that I knew I could handle that might be tough for her at the time. And then coming back, it was odd. We had my baby shower, and the very next day had a service for my father with his, family and our family and his friends from New York and people who had known him for a very long time. And it was such a weird dynamic to have to deal with in you want to be happy, but then you're also sad, but then you're trying to celebrate the life that's coming into this world, but also celebrate a life that just left the earth. And so to try and find kind of that joy again in the past and then carrying it forward to the future, I think is a very difficult thing, but we did it. I miss him every day. I will say though, I believe in reincarnation after having my son, because he is my father brought back to this earth to torture my mother. Hands down. I didn't believe in reincarnation until now, but I think it's a real thing.
If you could get a message across to your dad at this point in your life, after some years have passed, what would you say to him now?
Oh gosh, I would say to him, I think two things. One, I hope you're proud of me. But two, I thank you for being who you were and raising me to never give up, to take responsibility and accountability, right, for my actions and my future and my goals. And I hope that I'm embodying all of those qualities now being a parent, the same way he, was such a great parent to me. I hope to set my children up the way that he prepared me for life and for hardship and for success.
That's really beautiful. And clearly, your parents did something right because you have this amazing mindset, this great perspective, and you're doing really, really cool things. A lot of that is in the world of endurance. And I'm sure a lot of it is also not in the world of endurance. And when you think of all the hard things that you have chosen to do on purpose, what is the hardest thing that you've chosen to do on purpose? And why did you choose to do that thing?
So, oh gosh, interesting question. So, I actually think that I would automatically, my first instinct would to say like the trail race I just did a couple of weeks ago and did 6 hour trail race and ended with blisters all over my feet. And it was horrific in the moment. But I actually think one of the hardest, but it's been very rewarding, is choosing to go actually down this business venture with Sam and the Alpha corporate team and my business partner, Elizabeth, and the whole host of people that there's too many to count right now, to thank for going on this journey. It's been such a humbling experience. I consider myself a successful person, and to try and translate, my skills and my mode of thinking from large companies to kind of this small business venture where now I'm fully in charge. It's been a huge learning curve for me. It's been a lot of work, a lot of redirection, a lot of managing expectations, right? And Elizabeth and I constantly talk about this is okay, you know, again, that disappointment is that gap. And so how do we now fill that gap right now in the now in a way that is going to set up so when our future becomes the now, we are in a place where we at least expected to be or better. And that ranges anything. And I'm sure Sam and Jerry have talked about this. It's like you're constantly having to take action, but action in a way that's going to position you right to be in the best possible place and dealing with circumstances that come up again that happen outside of ourselves. But how do we absorb that? And I think that's all about, small building blocks and breaking down such a large goal, right? It's I'm going to open this business and we're going to achieve stabilization and we're going to become profitable and we're going to get this amount of members, right? That, if you take that concept, I mean, it seems like impossible, right? And so I think it's constantly breaking down those goals into digestible pieces.
Mm.
Um, and then addressing those digestible pieces in a way where you can then see your progress and then being able to pivot and take constant action. I think analysis paralysis is real. I think fear-based paralysis is real. And it's hard to not second guess yourself or to question a decision, to go down a road, to have to take a step back, to have to pivot. And I know, right, Sam, they constantly are doing this and they become experts at it. And I'm definitely still learning. It's been one of the hardest things that I've done in my life. And I'm hoping it, reaps the benefits tenfold. But it's definitely been a journey and kind of recognizing things about myself that I am actually not good at, doing the books. So we're going to need someone to do it, or I excel here, and really playing on your strengths, but also playing on others people's strengths so that collectively you set everyone up to succeed. So absolutely the hardest thing that I've chosen to do.
Now, I don't know if I've talked about this in the podcast, maybe in Sam's episode, but when Sam was opening Alpha Fit Club Westfield, I was getting ready to move to Philadelphia. And so I had this gap, this weird window where I was still living at home with my parents. Sam was opening up Alpha Fit Club Westfield, and I worked the front desk. I'd hand out towels to the members. I would clean the floor after class. And it was such a cool experience to be in that environment. And at the same time, it was such a privilege to watch some of the chaos behind the scenes before they launched, right after they launched, like absolute chaos. And there was a lot of learning that happened there. I have a couple thoughts, couple questions. I'll start with the fact that in Jerry's episode 41 of this podcast, he used the phrase ready, fire, aim to denote that sometimes you have to act before you have a direction. Sometimes you have to take imperfect action, even if it's scary, and let that action create clarity. And I think a lot of business is making decisions before you have the fully formed picture. I would also imagine that there are a lot of emotions that you have to manage without attaching them to specific things in business. And I'm wondering how you manage the emotions of business. And maybe we start there because, members come and go, staff members come and go. There are people who are thrilled with business. And maybe that one customer who, even though you did everything you could to provide a great experience, might not have thought it was the great experience that you wanted them to have. So, how do you manage all those emotions?
Right. So it's definitely been a roller coaster. I think everything from finding the property and negotiating the lease, right? That's a whole set of emotions in and of itself, right? Um, Writing your personal guarantees to then dealing with the construction and the delivery of the equipment. I mean, we were set to open and our half of our equipment was not delivered yet, right? They would not give us a delivery date.
Mm.
And it's like, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to get temporary, treadmills in? Like, how are we going to do this? And figuring it out and right, like you're taking action. The doors are opening. How do we pivot in a way to also then create the facade that everything is great? And then it is your job as the owner and as the leaders to deal and absorb with those emotions in the background in the most seamless way possible. So you are providing that experience to your members, the top tier treatment, and for your staff as much as you can. And I'm sure some of them are
Mhm.
going to listen to this and disagree with me, but I promise you
Ah.
all, we are 100%, constantly doing our best to be the leaders that we know we need to be. And we're learning and making mistakes, but it's like, how do you then guide the ship and steer the ship and then provide that leadership so then other people feel empowered to help create that success for the collective? And it's a lot because you're dealing with personnel and customers sometimes who could be, difficult, I think, in traditional sense. And how do you deal with that in a way that keeps the ship moving, but you're also handling it and not letting those things also internalization of those types of things, I think, can be so incredibly detrimental. And that's been a major work for me to not take those things to heart, to not take someone leaving to heart. Someone comes in the door, someone's going to leave, and sometimes it's going to be up and sometimes it's going to be down. And that's from a personal perspective now being so close to the ins and outs, and it's my money, it's my capital, like it's near and dear to my heart. Really understanding how to constantly encourage that forward momentum while dealing with the perceived setbacks is a skill. And I definitely will take a long time to master, but I do think everyone's living and learning and has the best interest of the brand in mind, as they continue to open.
Mhm. And I've got a quote that I'll share that I think goes along with what you said. And I'll also just acknowledge that even though the business I'm in doesn't have the same overhead as the business you have, I am in the coaching space. I am in the performance space. I'm working with individuals. And on that level, I can relate. And when it comes to the behind the scenes, I think every entrepreneur at some point has had some tears roll down their face in private and has had to collect themselves and take a deep breath and choose to move forward anyway. And I say that because it's true for me, and it sounds like maybe true for you as well. And I would just also urge anybody who's dealing with a small business, a medium business, maybe even a large business, to just have some compassion and understand that the people running it are human and that it's hard and that they're doing their best. And so, with that, I've got a quote from Darcy Luoma, who said, "Strength is about how you show up. It requires you to choose what energy and action you want to bring to a given situation. At its heart, strength is about self management. It's not about controlling your emotions, it's about honoring them and choosing what to do next. It's hard to stay in control and get yourself off of autopilot. It takes a lot of strength to move through the world with more thoughtfulness and intention.
I think that that is a fantastic way to sum up. I refer to it as mental diet, right? And I think you hear a lot of life coaches, right, say those things like change your mind, change your life. And I agree with it, right? It's how you then react is means everything. And I actually think this ties into the definition of endure, right? So when I was thinking about this podcast and thinking about kind of what endure means, the definitions kind of by definition, it actually has a negative connotation, right? Like to go through suffering. But at the same time, it also talks about remaining in existence, right? And to withstand a particular circumstance. And I think when you're thinking about enduring something, part of the challenge is it's so easy to perceive whatever you're going through as negative, right? And then the reactions that come from that perceived circumstance become negative. And I think the skill that insanely successful people have is the enduring of something doesn't necessarily have to be torturous. It doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be associated with suffering. You can perceive those emotions initially. And then I think where the skill comes in is, again, being able to flip that to then be able to use whatever the circumstance that you are enduring to lead to that reward and the resolution to get you to, again, your ideal reality.
It's all about perspective. In the previous episode 117, the guest Luke Hopkins talked about, if you go to a highway and you think about looking for a yellow car, when a yellow car drives by, you're going to be able to identify it very quickly. And in life, when we constantly have these negative thoughts running through our mind, worst case scenarios, the what ifs, when things pop up and give us a reason to attach those thoughts to those things, we're going to attach them. And the opposite holds true when we think positive, when we're optimistic, when we're hopeful, when we practice that reframing that you just spoke about. The next time something hard or challenging comes along, we don't have to see it as bad. We can acknowledge that it is hard. We can acknowledge that it's not what we wanted. And then we can reframe and attach a positive meaning and a hopeful outcome. And I'll also add a phrase that I heard a long time ago, and I can't remember where I heard it, but I love it. And I think it ties into endurance. And the phrase is, just because you're weary doesn't mean you're weak. And I think when we get tired, when we're enduring things, whether that's physical, mental, emotional, and we're weary, it can sometimes feel like we're very weak. But that's so far from the truth.
I had written this down when I was thinking about this, and I agree with you 100%, right? If you look for the yellow car, you're going to find it. If you look for problems, you're going to find them. If you look for avenues of opportunity, you will find them. It may be the perception that the opportunity is harder to spot than the negative things. But I think, again, that constant mental diet and that reframing, you will then see your world in a more positive light. And I think it's so important, but it takes constant work in all aspects. And I think from the endurance lens, right, it's being able to perform or behave anyway at a certain level in the immediate present moment while preserving the ability to continually perform at that same or higher level in the future, right? And that continual mindset is what is going to allow you to endure things both physically and mentally. And I think I always think of interval training, right? Like your goal is to keep the same pace each round as you fatigue over time, both mentally and physically. And I think that that kind of encapsulates what endurance is all about and why so many people fail at it, right? Is because I think it's easy to then start perceiving yourself as weak and then to give up. And I always tell myself this, both in business, personally, and in training. I do this a lot when I'm in the middle of something that feels horrendous physically. Is I always do the remember when game. So during this trail race, it was my first trail race by TPK Endurance. They're actually a really cool kind of startup. If anyone wants to check them out, did this trail race up in Sparta. I never trail run before. It was very humbling. And it was a 6-hour race and it was a 5K loop. And the goal for most, I think, was to get to 7 laps. And at lap 3, there was an incredibly steep incline. People were running. I don't know how. I was trying to hike at the bare minimum to move forward. And all of a sudden, right, like I was on mile 6. I was like, Sarah, you remember when you were at lap 3 and you said you were probably going to stop it at lap 4. And the same thing for the marathon. I did my first marathon, the Jersey City Marathon, back in April. And at mile 15, I was like, this is just not going to work. And it's that mental endurance of just the one foot in front of the other. And the next thing I know, I was saying to myself, remember when you were at mile 15 and you said you weren't going to keep going, and now you're at mile 23. Ironman, you could apply this to anything, right? Even work for a project. It's like, remember when we were at the start of this and we thought there was so much to do. And now we're at the 11th hour and we're at the end. And look how much I've accomplished. And I think, again, it's that constant reminder, and breaking it down in a way that's digestible for you without getting overwhelmed is really the key to success in every avenue of life.
I think that looking back and acknowledging small incremental progress is a really powerful strategy. And to be honest, when you said remember when, what my mind immediately went to was almost something different. It was, remember when you signed up for this race and you knew it was going to be hard and you wanted to hit a point where you wanted to quit, but you wouldn't. So remember when you chose this, right? Remember why you chose this. And I think that's very powerful too.
Yes. And again, that gets back to, right, the versions of self, right? So it's remember when the version of me was at the start line. And then it's the remember when you're in the thick of it. And then just when you look back and you're at the finish line, you're going to say, remember when those versions of me existed and now they no longer, right? Because I'm here now and I met my goal and I'm at the end. And it's kind of that evolution of self in real time that I think is so important. And of course, physical setbacks, you can't avoid them, and it stinks, right? I've cramped plenty of times. I've gotten nauseous. Like, there's certain things that you might not be able to control, but I do think at the end of the day, for people to constantly be trying to improve on that level of kind of mental clarity and really being strict with that, and having those mantras, like whatever gets you through it. When I just did Ironman 70.3 in Eagleman, it was my second time doing it, and I had gotten a flat tire the first time, and I went back determined to break 6 hours. I ended up doing it, but when I started on the run, so it's a half marathon after a 56-mile bike ride, and all I kept telling myself was, one, the remember when. I was like, remember when you were 5 miles in on this bike and now you're done. You're off the bike. It's the worst part for me personally. You're done with that. So remember when. And then I just kept looking around and telling myself that I was on a jog with friends. That's what I was doing. I was just on a jog with friends. I mentally started over. The swim and the bike never happened. They were behind me. I had fresh legs. And every 4 miles, I would mentally like switch off as if I hadn't done any of the previous miles in the race. And I just was like, okay, we're starting anew. We're going on a 4 mile run with friends, a jog. I wasn't really running, I was jogging, but right, we're jogging with friends. And that starting over, and I was like, new block, new block, new block. And it was compartmentalizing those segments in my head to convince myself that my legs felt fresh and I was starting anew. And that's what got me through the run. And again, not dwelling on the past, not dwelling that I just did the bike ride and my legs were shot, not dwelling that I ran 6 miles and I can't possibly run another mile. Like, no, I segmented it in my brain and those blocks were done. They were no longer relevant to my life. And that's what got me through the race in a way. And so just tips, right, and strategy for people who I think tend to struggle sometimes with feeling overwhelmed with the grandiose nature of certain things in life. I do think that can be a really helpful thing. And I do think then it helps increase your endurance, whether that is physical or whether that is mental or a combination of the two.
I use the same strategy every day, and I'll share a little bit of that for anybody who wants a bit of a different perspective. And maybe you're not doing triathlons or endurance races, maybe you just have long work days. And I woke up this morning a little bit before 4 a.m. and I worked out and I got home and I walked my dog, and that was my first block. And then I had a series of calls, and that was my next block. And then I ate some food and I had more calls, and that was my next block. And now I'm on my last stretch of work, quote unquote work, where I get to have conversations like this, and it's my last block. And I chunk my day in my mind, and it helps so much. So I love that strategy.
Yeah, it gets me through. Same thing with the long work days and balancing, corporate work, alpha work, my role as a parent. And I do think it's so important to, they all play a collective role in shaping who I am and how I choose to show up every day, but also being able to block it out. I think one allows you to give your full attention to things that are important, and everything plays, an equal number of importance. So how can you give everything 100%? But I think showing up, and that also really helps me as a parent, right? I'm incredibly busy. I am not home for a lot of the day. But when I show up at home, I am there and I show up as the best that I can. And the kids, constantly are asking, did I win a race? When I ran the marathon, my son, the first thing he said to me when I finished, I was like wobbling all over the place. It's like, Mommy, so many people came in before you. I
Just
was
in
like,
case, yeah, you didn't know.
noted. But, I want them to watch me, especially my daughter,
Mm.
right? In growing up, I work in a male dominated field. I compete in for most things. Actually, plenty of women are beasts in the races that I do, but right, historically male dominated races. And I want them to see that you can do anything at any age. I should be, by society standards, I'm like way past my prime, right? Especially in physical fitness world. But
Mm.
I'm stronger and perform better than I do at almost 40 than I did in college and post college, right? And even just showing up for my job and starting a business, right? In the middle of having so many other obligations, I want them to know that you should be taking risks and you can do whatever you want to do if you put your mind to it. And again, not being so focused on time as a linear thing, having that patience, having that constant dedication and focus to keep showing up day in, day out in whatever you're focusing on, and you will get there. It may not be the path that you think, it may not be in the time frame that you want. But again, that's all perceived in your reality. You are attaching expectations to your external circumstances, and if you bring it back within, right, that tends to go away. And I just want them to see what drive and passion gets you, and hard work, right? Because I think a lot of people expect things to get handed to them, and it's not how the world works all of the time. And so I want to be that role model for them and to give them a platform to be able to, carry that on and take those lessons and carry them as they develop into their own selves.
Uh, I'll probably go back and listen to that again many times, and I hope people listening can rewind a few minutes and re-listen. I think you actually answered my last question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you could add on top of it. You know, if somebody's listening to this podcast and they are going through a tough time, and maybe they're disappointed, maybe they are suffering in a way, maybe they just don't know where to go or what to do. And maybe you can think of this as someday this is your kids that you're going to speak to. What would you say to those people on top of what you already shared?
So oh, gosh, it's a good question. I, I think so. So, right, again, emotion and suffering is relative. Now, people are going through hard times that could be way more severe comparatively, right, than to others. Some might be dealing with the loss of a loved one. Some might be struggling financially to the point where it would affect, right, either living circumstances, bills not being paid. And so I think there's different levels of hardship, but again, hardship is relative, and undoubtedly things cause pain, but it becomes a choice, right, about how you respond. And again, the taking of the action, sitting and wallowing, as even though that is also a difficult thing, right, to sit with emotions and to process. action needs to then be taken. So again, if you're sitting in a position where there's financial hardship and struggle, it's what steps can I do, even if they don't lead to any immediate result that changes my circumstances? I then can be true to myself to know that I am doing everything I possibly can to change self and change circumstances, whether that means reaching out to financial advisors for a free consultation, right? Setting up automatic deposits into a savings account, applying for a new job. And again, it's those kind of building blocks of setting yourself up to then change your 3D reality. And this could be, loss of relationships, losses of jobs, loss of friendships, all of those things. If you're going through a tough time, I really think one of the most important things first is to bring it back to self and to bring it back inward. I'm not saying shut down from the world, but to really focus on yourself in bettering kind of your mental diet, your mental state. And right, they talk about lucky girl syndrome all the time, is like convincing yourself that you're constantly lucky and you're constantly in receipt of opportunities. You will start to see things that you maybe have not perceived as positive or as an actual opportunity or as an actual benefit. You'll start to actually see the positives in things. And then that then starts to open up the doors, because you're now not looking for the negatives, like nothing goes right for me. You're looking for the positives. Everything works out for me. And I think then opens up your mind to then recognizing avenues that you probably would have been shut off to because you were too busy wallowing in self-pity. I'm acknowledging that that's a skill, and it's much easier said than done. But that's the piece of advice I would give most people, is the first step is to really take a step back and assess sense of self. You are worthy. You are capable, right? You do have the mental strength. You do have the means. It's convincing yourself that you are enough to achieve what you want to achieve. And that's the first step. Without that, you're not going to get anywhere.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that was very well said, and also just brings me back to the idea of controlling what we can control and surrendering the rest, because there are a lot of things in life we can't control and could feel super overwhelming when we try to control those things. Sara, if people want to follow along with what you're doing, if they want to reach out, if they want to learn more from you or about the business, where should they go to do that?
Sure. So a couple things. So you can find me if anyone has questions and they would like to email me. It's Sara, SARA, at alphafitclub.com. Shameless marketing plug. You can also visit the Alpha Fit Club website and pop into one of our locations. I own the Basking Ridge location in Princeton. You can also give me a follow on Instagram. My handle is S Moserco. So SMOSERCO.
And I'll link that down in the description so it's easy for people to find. And Sara, I just wanted to thank you because it's been a long day for me. I've been looking forward to this, and this did not disappoint. I am energized and will probably have trouble sleeping tonight because I'll be thinking about all these things. So thank you for this, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you for having me. I was so excited to be here, and I thought this conversation was great. And I hope that listeners can take away some tidbit of advice or a snippet of my life, and hopefully it's worth the listen.
I know it was well worth the listen for everybody out there, and I can't wait to drop into a class. So I'll be there. Keep an eye out.
Please, absolutely. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Indoor podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. And one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Indoor Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.